I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. John McGoff, President of the Indiana State Medical Association. Dr. McGoff is a graduate of Indiana University School of Medicine, a practicing ER physician, and a retired Brigadier General of the Indiana Air National Guard. The title of his presentation, as you can see, is Sturm and Drang of Medicine. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John McGoff.
Well, thank you, Peter. In the proper German, it's Sturm and Drang, so just so you know that. First of all, does everybody hear me all right? Is this too loud or good? Okay. First of all, I want to thank the organizing committee from Dr. Wagner, who invited me to come speak to you, from Peter and Rob, who are on the committee, all those who put this together. If you could please stand up so that your fellow classmates can see. So, Rob, thank you very much. And then my next question is, how did you get the deans to let you guys get off to do this? Because I can tell you, 30 years ago, this would not have been possible. So when I was putting this talk together, what do you do first? You go to Google, right? And you look, and everybody loves TED Talks, right? Who doesn't love a good TED Talk? So believe it or not, if you Google TED Talks, there's a TED Talk on how to give a TED Talk. And it starts out like this. You got to have Google Earth in there somewhere. And so that gets everybody's attention. And the speaker has to stand up here and he has to take long pauses and kind of look. And he has to say some really profound things. So I thought, getting into med school is hard. And then you need audience participation. So how many agree with that one out there? There you go. And you got to go a little farther, though. And med school is harder. How many agree with that one? Right? But now, so we've got you all hooked up. Here it comes. This is the one you've all been waiting for. But practicing medicine, piece of cake. All right. So the title of my piece was Sturm and Drang. And I happened to be looking through the paper a couple months ago, and it came up. And I was a German minor at IU. It was the worst minor. I'd never had an opportunity to use it. But here's my big chance right now. So how many are familiar with this term? Any German speakers in there? A few. All right, Peter, you get it. So what it means is storm and stress. And it came out of the 1750s, the 1780s in Germany. Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Germanic people at that time. At that era, it was the center of technology. It was the center for military power. It was the center for arts and literature and music. So you think about Goethe and Mozart and all those kind of things. It was during this time frame. So it was one of the most prosperous periods during that century with those people. But guess what was also going on during that same time period? Suicides. They had this tremendous amount of suicides. So you have the most prosperous nation in Europe back in the 1750s, and it's young people who were committing suicide, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. And so that's what the Sturm and Drang was, is why, after coming out of Enlightenment, we're in this period of prosperity, why were people committing suicide? So as you probably know, suicide is a first world problem. It doesn't usually happen in the third world countries. It's one in the first world, and that's why we're seeing what we're seeing here in America today. So where are we at right now as physicians? So physicians used to be one of the most respected professions. Every year they come out with a listing of respected professions. And as you could probably imagine, physicians, nurses, military are always at the top. Down at the bottom, who's down there? Lawyers, politicians. And so unfortunately, we've seen that ebb over the years. So why is that coming about? You've gone into this profession to take care of people. Why is the general population thinking differently about you? Does it have anything to do with the modern practice of medicine, where you go to see the doctor and he's typing in the chart and not looking at the patient in the eye? Does it have anything to do with the fact that now you got 10-minute appointments? You got to hustle people through to meet your number? Is that maybe why people don't perceive it? Or is it physicians themselves? I'll give you an anecdote. A couple of months ago at my facility, it's 4:30 in the afternoon. I'm an emergency physician by training, and there's a surgical complication. The patient is in who's had a post-op complication. And just so happens that that patient's surgeon is walking through the ER. And they go, hey, doctor, hey, you know, Mrs. Jones is in here and she's got a surgical complication. Your patient. He looks and goes, ooh, I'm getting off here in about a half an hour. Why don't you give it to the guy who's on call? And walks out. You know, I can tell you that would not have happened 30 years ago. But if physicians think of themselves as employees, it does happen. And it happened to me just a couple of months ago. So that's kind of why we're maybe seeing this meter go the other way. And so you need to think in the back of your mind, how can you be a better doc and not do something like this? So here's the deal. What I'm going to tell you today is just my story. Every one of you in here is going to have a story. And so it's mine. It's not right. It's not wrong. You know, be happy to talk about it afterwards. But I knew pretty early on that I wanted to be a physician. And probably many of you in here did as well. It often starts in high school when you do well in science or math, and you know, you have this kind of aptitude. So I'm sure everyone in this, you know, student body here did well in science. So you're kind of already going down that road. But when I was 16, I had the opportunity to volunteer at the Eskenazi, or was then Wishart Emergency Department. It was one of the busiest trauma centers in the city of Indianapolis. And they would let you do anything. Just, hey, stand in the back of the room and make sure you don't get in anybody's way. But I got the opportunity to see trauma resuscitations, you know, CPR, people coming in, you know, critically ill. And I knew right then, I said, I want to be that guy. The guy who's, you know, directing the ballet that was going on in front of me there in the emergency department. So we get into medical school, and maybe it's not exactly what we thought. The first 2 years when I went through, it was all books. Books, books, and more books. And I know that they've changed up the curriculum for you guys, but it's essentially just undergraduate on steroids. Just pile more and more on it, go to class, take tests, and that was essentially it. And then we started hitting our rotations, and that to me was the aha moment when you actually got to touch patients. So I told the story last night to a couple of the folks, but my very first rotation was surgery at the Wishart. It's a very, very difficult rotation. There's 4 brand new students in there. We hit the door. We don't know what we're doing. We don't know how to write a SOAP note. We don't know how to take care of a patient. But there's this one guy, and he's out there. He's got it all figured out. He knows where the supplies are. He knows how to write notes. And I'm thinking, this guy's a superstar. You know, I want to be like him. So 2 days in, we come to find out, well, he's actually failed surgery, and he's repeating it now for the second time. So that's why he was the superstar. When we went to medical school, we all had side hustles. And you'll hear that'll be a little bit of a theme for me today. But almost everybody worked. And we had an opportunity to have different types of jobs. So as a first or second year medical student, you could go to Wishart and watch the monitors and get paid, you know, work all night to watch the cardiac monitors. Or during your junior and senior year, we had what they called externships. And externships were essentially the predecessors, PAs, and nurse practitioners. So you got paid to work in an emergency department as a junior or senior medical student. And you went there and you got to sew, you got to see patients, you got to do essentially all the same things that, you know, our paraprofessionals do today. So a lot of people did that. I did physicals in a nursing home. So everybody kind of had a little side gig while they were going through their third and fourth rotations. So able to make it through. Our senior year was 100% elective. And so I'm a little bit of a wanderer, so I decided to do rotations all over the country. I did radiology at UCLA. I did emergency medicine out in D.C. I did flight medicine down in Texas, and so kind of traveled around. But then came back at the end of that spring of my senior year, and then, one other thing I just want to touch on. During our medical school, there were certain rules, and one of the most important ones is you had to be there early. So you typically had to do pre-round rounds. Does everybody know about those, or do they still do those? So you have to get there, so especially on pediatric surgery at Riley. You had to get there at 4:30 in the morning to pre-round, so then you could get with your resident to round, so then the attendee could round. So by 7:30 or 8, that patient had been seen 3 times by you. And then also, you had to be the last one to leave. So you can imagine, it was pretty long and grueling hours. But there was always one rule that they had there during med school. There's no crying. If you've seen this movie, there's no crying in baseball. There's no crying in medicine. So you weren't allowed to. You just had to kind of tough it out, and that was what you signed up for, and just make sure you show up the next day. So there's me in between first and second year. As Peter said, he had his 12-year-old brother help him out. I had my 21-year-old daughter. And so this is her slide here. She goes, oh, you got to put that in there. And she goes, but there's got to be a caption to it. So this is me, you know, between first and second years med school. And so her caption was, prepare to add 35 pounds, go gray and lose your hair. So this is what's going to happen to you. So match day is coming up Friday. Truly one of the most exciting experiences you can imagine. Frightening and exciting. I don't know who thought it up. It's the craziest thing. When you try to explain to somebody who's not in medicine about match day, they can't understand it. So my match went like this. I put down Philadelphia, New York, D.C., Chicago, L.A., and on that Friday morning, you know, they hand you an envelope, and it's, you're going to ... And I ended up going to Philadelphia, to Thomas Jefferson, where they just started a brand new emergency medicine program. So residency, is, you know, on my first, you know, TED Talk is even harder than medical school. Especially back then, the rotations that we had often were every third night call. There was no protected coverage. 80 hours a week were the norm, not the exception. And so what did we deal with? A lot of exhaustion. You probably heard the president, you know, talk about some certain S-hole countries over in Africa. Well, where I trained in Philadelphia, we went to Camden, New Jersey, and it truly was one of those S-hole cities. It had the highest murder rate, the highest poverty rate. It was a tough place. And Cooper Hospital, where we trained, had a separate emergency department just for trauma. And they saw 115 to 130 traumas every single month. You stabilized them there, and they had a trauma ICU up above, 10 beds, and they, you know, stabilized them, took them to the OR, and you took care of them on the floor. 24 hours on, 24 hours off, 2 months straight. So you had to get there early, because remember, you got to do your pre-round rounds. You went and you took care of all the patients. Then you finished up. You spent the whole night in the hospital. You went home, slept, and you started over for 2 months straight. So truly physical exhaustion. True story, my very first day on this rotation, I get there, and I'm doing my pre-round rounds, and in those days, everybody in the ICU got an x-ray, chest x-ray. So I go and I lay up the 10 x-rays of all the patients, and, you know, I'm getting ready to give my first day there. Well, somewhere in between, somebody had moved those x-rays. So I point to the patient in bed 1, and I go, oh, this is Mr. Jones. You know, he was intubated 2 days ago, and he's got a chest tube. And the attending looks at me and he goes, that guy doesn't have a chest tube. He's not intubated. And he proceeds to berate me in front of everybody. So the learning lesson was, now you not only have to get there early, but you got to make sure nobody, you know, messes with your slides. So this was just, you know, kind of a normal rotation for 2 months. So you survive residency. Everything works out pretty well. And then you get your first job. So I started here at Community Hospital. My wife's from Philadelphia. I met her there, and she said, we either got to live in Philadelphia or Indianapolis. So I interviewed a lot of places there, and interviewed in Fort Wayne and Elkhart and Bloomington and Indy. And a buddy of mine from medical school said, hey, they're looking for ER docs out of community. Would you like to join? Never stepped foot in the place. Went and interviewed with the senior partners, and seemed like a pretty neat group. And they had a unique schedule at the time. You worked a week, off a week. So you worked a week, off a week. And you did that for 2.5 months, and then you got a 3-week vacation. So every 3 months, you got a 3-week vacation. So it was a pretty good gig starting out. So my very first day, July 3rd, 1987, I walk into the Community East Emergency Department, and back then everything was obviously paper charts and clipboards, and they had a rack for who was the next patient to be seen. And so that rack, when I walked in there that morning at 10 a.m., had 20 patients in it. So I look at the guy who I'm working with, who's on the day shift on the swing, and I go, so, and he goes, well, you're 20 behind, dig in, you'll figure it out. So that was my orientation on my first day on the job. And, you know, I did figure it out. But, you know, we're much better at this now. When we bring in new residents, we make sure they're always double covered. We make sure they have some orientation shifts, that they can figure out all the, you know, the who, what, when, and how. So in residency, you're going to learn the practice of whatever it is, surgery or OB, so you're going to know that. But it's a lot of times the politics of working in a new facility. Who do you call for this, or how do you, you know, refer that? And those are the nuances that you don't learn. Here's a fun fact for you. Your very first year out of residency, you'll learn more than you have your entire residency, med school, and undergrad, because that's the first year that you're ultimately responsible. And when you're standing there at 3 in the morning with a difficult airway, and you look around, and there's nobody there except for you, you realize that it's your responsibility, and you're the one who has to take care of this patient and make sure that they have a good outcome. So I told you a lot about side hustles. So this was one that I got to jump into in 1982. They came around to the medical school and they said, who'd be interested in joining the National Guard? And, so I listened to it, and I said, hey, if you show up Saturday, we'll put you in a helicopter, we'll fly you down, and we'll do a physical at Atterbury. I go, I can at least do that. So jump in, go down there, and start interviewing. There was both the Army Guard and the Air Guard. And at that time, we had 2 units in Indiana, one in Fort Wayne and one in Terre Haute, and they were flying F-4s. And they said, if you sign up for this, you can become a flight surgeon, which basically means you're the physician for the pilots, and they're going to put you in the back seat, and you're going to get to fly fighter jets. Who wouldn't want to do that? So during medical school, I came up with this plan. Let me knock out my schooling, because to be a flight surgeon, you had to go to Texas for 2 months to learn the nuances of flight medicine. And I convinced them to let me go down there, get paid, and get my training so that upon graduation, I was able to jump in the back seat. And the F-4, you really needed the person in the back seat, because that was the guy who was running the radars, running the radios, and he was actually a crew member. This was during the Reagan years, so we kind of ebb and flow with dollars, and there were a lot of dollars in defense at the time. So I told you I trained out in Philadelphia. On Friday night, remember the Guard is 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year. That's the hook. So it's really not that bad. And I'm thinking in the back of my head, with this new job I've got, I can squeeze this in. But during the Reagan years, there was a lot of money, and they needed flight hours. So they would fly an F-4 out to New Jersey. I'd jump in the back seat, fly to Fort Wayne, do my drill for the weekend, and fly me back. That was how I transported back. So who couldn't, do that? But it was just an opportunity that was there, and it turned out to be a side hustle. But it got to do a lot of other things. I got to spend a month in Antarctica. So the Air National Guard took over that mission. It's a plane with skis that basically just, during the summer months down there, ferries food and fuel to the South Pole to make sure the people who are there over the winter, because you can't get in or out once it starts getting cold down there, you just ferry it. So I went down there and spent a month. Now, if you were going to go to the South Pole, what would you get all prepped up on? What would you study? Cold injuries, right? That's the obvious one. I never saw a single cold injury when I was down there. You know what you see down there, and this is going to be so obtuse you won't believe it, but it's high-altitude pulmonary edema and high-altitude cerebral edema, because the South Pole is at 10,000 feet. It's just this gigantic layer of ice. It's also the driest place on the world, and so if you throw somebody in there who's not acclimated and they start unloading boxes and things, they unfortunately are susceptible to those complications of altitude. And so I had to airlift 2 people off during that time with those complications. The other opportunities I had to deploy a couple times overseas to all 7 continents, everywhere from Africa, Europe, the Middle East multiple times. In 2006, I was in Germany ferrying patients back from Afghanistan and Iraq. And then 2008 and 2009, I was the head of the emergency facility at Balad, which was the largest trauma center in Iraq at the time. We just come through the surge, so it was very fortunate. Probably 80% of the casualties at that time were Iraqis and not Americans, but we'd often get American casualties. But again, I had a lot of training, a lot of trauma training, but nothing prepared me for when you see what an IED can do to somebody with traumatic amputations of 3 or 4 of their limbs. So it was a very kind of difficult period, just from the medicine, but also the remoteness. There's not a lot to do there. You go to the gym, you go to work, you go to church. Those are kind of your 3 options. But it was during that time phase, I told my family, it's a safe place. They're never going to let a physician get hurt. And so where we were, it was a hardened facility. Periodically they'd launch rockets on the base, but it was really, I never really felt threatened. But on Christmas Day of 2008, at an outlying post in Mosul, which was about 100 miles north, there were 4 physicians. It was Christmas Day. They had just gone to church, and one of the docs goes, hey, I'm going to run back in and get my camera. As he's running back in, one of those rockets was launched and killed him. It was an Army reservist, just had gotten in country, 2 children, and incidentally, he was from the Philadelphia area and worked at the trauma center there in Philadelphia. So kind of a difficult situation. So during when I first got back during residency, a buddy of mine, boyhood friend, was a city county councilor. And he goes, hey, John, would you help out? And I said, sure. So, I'd help him get elected and do some things, and you get a little bit of of political flavor on you. And at the time, in the mid-'90s, we had a huge crisis in Indianapolis, and our coroner at the time was front page. He was having all kinds of problems with the coroner system, and he was just making mistakes. And so my buddy goes, "Hey, would you be willing to do that? It's a part-time job, doesn't take that much." And I go, "Oh, let me take a look at this." But also, you have to run for a political office to be elected to do it. So you're down ballot. Nobody really knows that they'll pull the ticket and you'll get it. So in 1997, I was elected as the county coroner here in Indianapolis. And I didn't realize how busy it was. Yeah, I had a staff of 14, and I had a budget, and I had 3 forensic pathologists, but we saw 2,000 cases every year. We brought in about 1,000, and we did about 750 autopsies. And in 1997 and 1998, we had a huge crisis in Indianapolis, and it was crack cocaine. We were late to crack cocaine. It didn't come to Indianapolis. And so those 2 years, I had 160 homicides the first and 162 homicides the second, all due to crack cocaine, much like what we're seeing here today with the heroin epidemics, although this was more interpersonal violence and not the overdose deaths like that I see every day in the emergency department. And that comes to why I was invited here today is organized medicine. And I'm currently the president for the State Medical Association here, and representing 8,300 physicians around the state. So when I was in your shoes, couldn't spell ISMA, didn't know what they did. Went out to Jefferson, came back, got a little bit involved with the emergency medicine, but wasn't involved in organized medicine. There are some students in here who sit on our board, and so they know what the State Medical Association does for you. So for me, it's your advocacy group. So right now, we have 2 full-time lobbyists who are working at the State House covering doctors' issues. And a lot of them you'll never hear about. You may hear about this bill or that, but there's a lot of things that they're doing where they're kind of playing defense. For instance, we passed a bill that the State Medical Association concurred with, that physicians are going to be required to take mandatory education about opiates. Indiana is one of the only states in the nation that doesn't require mandatory education for anything, let alone for opiates. And as you well know, and I can tell you, I've had senators and representatives look at me and say, this opiate problem is your fault. In fact, the Attorney General put on a conference a couple months ago, and he brought in Chris Christie, who was Trump's drug czar. And he looked at the crowd, and he said, physicians, you guys have a murder weapon. It's called the prescription pad. Calling out docs in front of this, I just kind of wanted to slink in my chair and pretend I wasn't there. So I take full ownership that physicians have been involved in this, and we're going to try to help rectify it. And one of the things is to make sure that physicians understand the scope of the problem. And so we stood up, and there's going to be some blowback from doctors. Why would you, say that you're okay with mandatory CME? Because it's the right thing to do. The second thing that the state medical does for you is provides insurance. And again, it's way over your head, but right now, half of the physicians work for a hospital. So they have all their benefits and everything covered. That means the other half's out there who are private practitioners who need to worry about things about payroll and insurance and that, and the ISMA offers a great product for that. And then lastly, we provide education. We right now are providing every month a free opioid seminar to anybody. Don't have to be a State Medical Association member, but it's to whoever wants can go online and take this. So I want to show this picture here. This was taken about probably 20 years ago. And basically there was a group of us who, just like you, buds in med school. Does everybody take a look at the person to the left and to the right and introduce yourself right now. All right, now I'm going to tell you, I'm going to tell you why that's important, what you guys did and why that's important. So I show you this picture because we had a gang of probably 8 to 10 people that I knew, grew up with in medical school that went all over. But we'd always get together every 2 or 3 years for some type of event, with spouses, without spouses, golfing, hiking, there'd be something. I want to point out just a couple stories in here. The guy in the front row right there with the pretty lady in the red dress, he was probably the smartest guy in our medical school class. went out to Seattle, did internal medicine, got an infectious disease, had a phenomenal practice. He was inside Microsoft before anybody even knew what it was. Loaded up on it, was fabulously wealthy, had 2 children. So this picture was taken in Las Vegas. That was our trip that year. And we're playing golf earlier that day, and he's not swinging as well. This guy played high school golf. He's a really, really good golfer. He goes, yeah, I got some kind of lump down here. Yeah, you better go get that checked out. Maybe it's a reactive lymph node or something like that. So we get a call the Tuesday that following week, and he goes, I got some bad news. I got lymphoma. And oh, man. So we all know that, and it wasn't just your normal form. It was one that was going to require a lot of treatments. 2 years later, multiple chemotherapies, 2 bone marrow transplants, he dies. So he's got 2 children. His wife was actually from Paris, and that was one of our fun trips. We got to go to their wedding over in France, so the whole gang up there got to do that. But I won't point out some of the other members, but I'll point out some of their situations. One of the fellows up there turns 50, and he goes, I'm 50, I better get a stress test. So he goes to the doctor, gets a stress test. He's driving home, and they go, you got to turn around right now. Why is that? And they go, you just got to turn around. He spins around. They do a heart cath. 2 hours later, he's on the table having a bypass. Didn't have no pains, no clues, nothing, just fortuitous that he treated himself to a stress test. So another fellow up there, he and his wife had 3 children. Everything was working out great. They moved around the country multiple times, but they finally were settled. They built their dream home. The kids are out of the house. He comes home from work one day, finds her dead in the garage from suicide, carbon monoxide. Another fellow up there is right now dealing with a rare thymus cancer. There's only 200 in the United States. He drives every Thursday, once a month, to the NIH at Bethesda and gets chemotherapy for this thymus tumor that he has. Another a guy up there is probably this month going to give it up. He's practiced for 30 years. He's just burned out. You know, he did emergency medicine, and then he kind of lateraled into urgent care, and he's just tired, really, of the way the patients are treating him. And it's become now an us against them situation, and he's going to give up practice. So just a microcosm, 10 people that were in a room just like this, 30 years later, how things can end up. So what is burnout? You know, I was talking a little bit about Maslow, but, you know, when I saw this quote, I mean, it's the erosion of the soul. So Maslow was, 1981, a psychologist who did a survey. It's 22 questions. It's since broadened out into multiple industries. It's kind of the go-to survey that you use for burnout. And I know that this slide's going to come up in another one of the talks. It just came out, but it actually has it by specialty. So you see emergency medicine's up there in 6. And where's Dr. Gunderman? You guys are right behind us at 7 on there on radiology. So it's kind of an interesting, but if you really want to get burned out, it looks like you got to go into plastic surgery. I mean, 23%. So just kind of an interesting, this just came out this week. The validity of it, I'm not certain how it was done. I can certainly tell you that all physicians are burned out right now. So what are the signs and symptoms of burnout? First and foremost, exhaustion. But you know, I told you about working all those hard hours in residency and that's a physical exhaustion, but it's also this emotional exhaustion that when you wake up in the morning and you're not excited about going to see patients, that you're just thinking about, hey, can I put the pillow over my head? Can I make that alarm just go off? That you're not excited about seeing what you've been called to do. The cynicism, that black humor that we deal with every day. You know, why is this person here? Does anybody know the term Gomer? You know, there's a book, House of God. It came out 40 years ago. It was kind of a required read when I was a student. And it's a very cynical book about medicine. And so Gomer is an acronym. And it's get out of my emergency room. So, you know, when you see that patient in there, you go, oh, not that guy again. He's a Gomer, you know. That's the cynicism that, you know, preludes burnout. And then your loss of professional efficacy. And I'll go through some of those. So how does it manifest in a physician? Mayo study from 2014, 54% of physicians are manifesting some form of burnout right now. And that's up 9% from a few years earlier. So clearly this trend is going in the wrong direction. So what we're doing here today, and the other speakers are going to follow, will hopefully have some tools to help you guys not experience what's going on presently in medicine. Decreased patient satisfaction and lower quality of care. Right now, I get a scorecard on patient satisfaction. So the hospital comes up every month and they say, hey, John, you know, you weren't there in a timely fashion, or you didn't smile, or this or that. But so we actually are getting a scorecard. And imagine how difficult it becomes when I tell maybe somebody who is an opioid addict that, you know, I'm not going to give them that script, that I think maybe physical therapy or OMM or something else would be a better choice for them. And they came in there for opiates. You know how they're going to rate me. He was a horrible doctor. He didn't do a good job. Yet that's, you know, so in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, how do I win this thing? I'm getting this scorecard, and, you know, the only way I'm going to win is by, and you can imagine why this feeds into burnout. High error rates. This is a tough one, tough one to measure. So I had the opportunity to spend 4 years on the medical licensing board here in Indiana. And you are the physicians who actually discipline other doctors. And so I can tell you everything that a physician's done wrong. You know what the easy ones are? The physician who gets caught drunk driving, or the physician who gets caught abusing opioids, or the physician who gets caught having an inappropriate relationship with their patient. Those are easy. We can discipline those all day long. But how do you grade one doctor's quality over another? Is it based on malpractice suits? Because that's a way lag indicator. You've harmed a lot of people if you're waiting for malpractice suits. Is it an allegation from a disgruntled partner because you guys split it up and he doesn't like you anymore? Well, believe it or not, that does happen. So quality, the high errors in that are sometimes difficult to find, but so important, because on the end of every error is a patient who's been harmed. Drug and alcohol abuse, like I said, those are so frequent that physicians, we have tremendous access first. And for instance, anesthesiologists, 20% of anesthesiologists, a little bit of an old study, had some problem with substance abuse because of the access to the medications, but also self-medicating with alcohol. That previous picture I showed you of those buddies of mine, one of them had a DUI, and one of them wrecked his car under the influence of alcohol at some point in their career. Divorce. One of the highest rates of divorce in any specialty. I interviewed, I told you, all around, and one of my interviews was at Johns Hopkins. And at Johns Hopkins at the time, you had to do a surgical internship before you could do your 3-year emergency medicine. I thought, man, it's Johns Hopkins. You got to get a diploma from then. I go, so tell me about the surgical internship. It was every other night call for the whole year. And they had a great statistic that they bragged about. We have a 100% divorce rate in our group. It was like, really? But, I mean, you can imagine what a toll that would do to a family. But that was actually told to me when I'm doing my interviews that, really, that's something you're proud of. And lastly, physicians, twice as likely to commit suicide as the general population. So I mean, we know this better than others. I showed you a slide. It wasn't the doc, but it was the doc's spouse who did that. And we have to do better. So why? I heard about they're going to hand out Superman capes, for the kids. But all physicians think they're Superman too. I can stay up all night. I can do this. I can take a few more patients. We're trained to, just tough it out. But all the while, we're getting beat both physically, emotionally, and mentally. And we're getting pulled on many different fronts. You hear about this work-life balance. To be honest with you, I'm not certain what it means. I think it's a great quote, and hopefully you'll get some great nuggets today, but it's very, very hard to do to, keep your doctor hat on when you're at work and not to take that doctor hat home with you, to take it off at the door and spend your time with a spouse or, your child or, the other requirements that are going to take, your time as you get out. And right now, I mean, you're focused on studying, and that's great. But as you get older, then you're going to have mortgages and student loans. I mean, how many of you are going to have $200,000 in student loans? And if that's not hanging over your head, I don't know what is. So resilience. Here's the textbook, resilience is the ability to recover from setbacks, adapt well to change, keep going or choose to give up in the face of adversity so you emerge stronger, wiser, and more able. Great platitude, kind of hard to put to work. One of the things that I learned when I was in the military, think about Israel as a country. They're surrounded, water on one side, and a lot of people don't like them on the others. The military in Israel has what they call a stress inoculation. They put their soldiers through this training to try to help them be more resilient because in the face of what they experience every day. So I thought it's kind of fortuitous. My daughter, I talked about earlier, she just got home for spring break, and she threw this book there, and it's a book I'd read probably in high school, and she must have read it for one of her courses. But how many know the story of Elie Wiesel and probably read Night? I think most of us had. But think about his resilience. This guy's a prisoner of war in Buchenwald, one of the worst places you could possibly be. And he said, some of the men spoke of God, his mysterious ways, the sins of the people, and redemption to come. As for me, I had to cease to pray, and I concurred with Job. And you remember the story of Job. Job is the guy he was the most righteous guy, and God makes a deal with the devil. And Job is just horribly cursed, but he never gives up his faith, but he has tremendous suffering. So here's a great story of resilience. So I'm looking at the paper just a couple days ago, and this one pops up. And this is Bevelin Ali. She's 19 years old. She's a Kurd from northern Iraq. She's been fighting for 7 years, the last 4 of which is ISIS. And she's finally, and this is the quote from it, and she goes, "I'm just tired." So think of the resilience of this young lady. She only wrote her mother 3 times the last 4 years that she was gone. Her mother thought, perhaps that she was dead. How about her resilience? And one of my all-time heroes, I don't know if anybody recognize him at all, a fellow named Ernest Shackleton, but I'd highly recommend the book Endurance. And so when I was at the South Pole, you get to learn about what went on in the 1910 through 1916. That was the moonshot, who could get to the South Pole first. And he almost made it. He got 60 miles short of it and did the right thing, turned around and didn't do it. You remember Scott did it, didn't turn around in time, lost his life. Amundsen ended up being the first one. So in 1914, this guy goes, well, I'm going to do something better. He's a Brit, a very tough guy. He goes, I'm going to go all the way across Antarctica. And so he puts together this team of 27 men, and they get on their boat, and they're all prepared. It's going to be a very long journey. They get stuck in pack ice. They're 1,200 miles away from the closest island. That means they got to winter the whole time that they're there, wait for this all to melt, and then you can see their boat's crushed, but they got these 3 dinghies that they're going to have to go back 1,200 miles. It takes them almost 2 years. Not a single person loses their life. They're all healthy. And they said, what was great about this guy? His tools to keep his team together in this adverse time and to focus on resiliency were his generosity, his intelligence, his strength, and his compassion. So if you like to read, it's an easy read. In fact, I saw there was a book out now, the Endurance Rules for Leadership. You can actually use this for team building. So what's going to make you resilient? So now you've seen some great folks who are out there. I only have a couple ideas in my mind. There's some phenomenal speakers coming on who are going to give you some other ideas. Sleep. So this is a book just came out a few months ago by Matthew Walker. He's a PhD, and he's dedicated his entire research to sleep, and it talks about the importance of it. So I've just told you about how much of my career, and still as an emergency physician, we still do night shifts. We're rotating. How do you best function with little sleep, and how do you try to maximize to get the best sleep? So again, it's a quick and easy read, but believe it or not, as simple as that is, to try to get sleep when you can. The biggest problem with folks in this room, I guarantee you, is your devices. You got to cut loose. When it's time to go to bed, you got to put that thing somewhere else, and believe me, it'll help you sleep. Nothing bad is going to happen through the night that won't be there in the morning when you wake up. The second thing is this book was written in 1996 by Daniel Coleman, and it talks about emotional quotient. So everybody knows the IQ. Everybody in this room is in the top 1 or 2% in intelligence. You don't get into medical school if you're not bright. So that's just a given. But what we don't do as well teaching is the emotional quotient, how to evaluate and control and express our emotions. And they have some tools with social emotional learning. If you go online, he's written a couple books since then and does training. But this is where I think it's so key to, we got the book learning smarts, but it's that emotional piece, how we handle our patients, and especially when we have those difficulties, those gomers who come into my emergency department. I'll tell you, this is going to be heresy, and you can't let it out of this room, but you know what really saved my practice of medicine? The electronic health record. How does that make sense? How could that have helped me? I'll tell you why. It's because of scribes. So it's not the electronic health record. It's the worst thing that anybody ever invented. My very first day when Epic was started in our hospital, it was day 3. I came in on the day shift. The first patient I saw there had been there for 8 hours. And it was a chronic back pain patient who, I'm going to say, hey, you need some physical therapy. I'll give you some naproxen. He goes, for 8 hours I've waited for that, and it was because of the electronic health record. But now we have scribes. So when I walk in a room, I introduce myself. I sit down with them. I look them in the eye. I ask their complaints. They're off in the corner. These are budding med students, nursing students who are typing up that record. I do a physical exam on them. As we're walking back to the desk, I'm telling them, hey, here's what was on my physical exam. And then we order our labs, et cetera, and then we're talking about the medical decision-making process. So typically, at the end of that encounter, my chart's probably 90% done. Yet I've had the opportunity to interact directly with that patient. So don't tell anybody, but, I'm not a fan of the electronic health record, but one of the side effects was it actually helps my practice. And I think, in fact, may prolong some physicians' practices. If you have the capability, and our group did, the hospital doesn't support it, we pay for the scribes. So you got to make your own luck. You have to widen your own aperture. So remember I told you the story back when I first started in the F4 and you're sitting back, you had your head down looking in the radar. And, you do mock dogfights where two planes would come at each other at, 500 miles an hour. And the radar, you'd sweep broadly until you found your target, and then you start to narrow it down and hone down. But you have to start out with that broad target. For the first and second year med students in here, you got to keep your mind wide open. You're going to come to a critical juncture, probably third year-ish, where I call it the big Y. And you're going to have to decide, am I going to go this surgical track, urology, surgery, ENT, or am I going to go maybe this more medical bent, peds, family practice, internal medicine? 95% of young medical students have that figured out. So you kind of know in your mind what your skill set is. You've been on some rotations, you've been exposed to this, and you kind of decide. So initially, make sure you keep your aperture wide open. Improve your odds. Take chances. It's tough right now, but as I said, I always had a side hustle, and for me, that was increasing my odds. Somebody came and said, hey, would you be interested in doing this? And if I could fit it in a schedule, and say, yeah, that seems like that may work. So always take some chances out there. If you don't swing and miss, then you're not batting enough. That's a baseball stat. You got to get up there and try different things. And then lastly, you can think yourself lucky. Optimism is incredibly important. And sometimes when you're down in the dumps and things aren't going so well, it's hard to be optimistic. But the studies have shown that those who are optimistic are more successful. And so if you find yourself really down and you feel yourself on the edge of burnout and you're not looking at the positive side, you got to figure out what it takes to re-energize you. Talk with a counselor, talk with a friend, take some time off, whatever it is to make sure that you keep that optimistic perspective. So I just want to talk a little bit about the future. This is the 50th anniversary of this. Has anybody ever seen this movie? All right, there's a couple sci-fi nerds in there. But this was groundbreaking when it came out in 1968. And the premise of it, you have to watch the first. It's a little wacky, and I still highly recommend it. It's one of the top 5 movies of all time. But in the middle of it, it's this piece about space exploration. And this guy is the lead captain, and I forget they're going to Mars or somewhere. But it's all about artificial intelligence. So remember, this is 1968. Cell phones, all the things that we have right now, laptops, all that are not around. So Stanley Kubrick, the guy who wrote and directed this, he goes, at the time, there was no Google, there was no Microsoft, there was no Facebook. He goes to IBM. He goes, think 50 years out, what is it going to look like? And so they describe the space station, and there's a scene in there where he's getting his news on essentially an iPad. For 68, that's incredible. So interestingly enough, when Samsung comes out with their own equivalent version of iPad, Apple sues them and said, oh, no, we were the ones, this is our intellectual property. And they go, well, how could that possibly be? I saw it in this movie in 1968. This has existed forever. But it's a very, very futuristic movie. So what's going to happen to the folks in this room? How about that? What do people think about that? Right upper low, what's kind of infectious disease, maybe tuberculosis. And Dr. Gunderman and I were talking about this last night at dinner. So they did a study for screening for tuberculosis. The computer got it right 96% of the time, more than the radiologist. So think about that. He doesn't want to get put out of a job, but he's a little worried he's got some competition here. Yeah, okay. And then here's an EKG. There was a study done for cardiology, and it looked at factors for heart disease. Same thing happened. You take a patient, you put them through this exercise with artificial intelligence. They got it better than the cardiologist did. So here's the pledge. Just came out in 17. The fourth years in here are going to say something similar to this. I solemnly pledge to dedicate my life to the service of humanity. The health and well-being of my patient will be my first consideration. I will attend to my own health. And there's like 14 things, but the very last one, I want to flip this and put that at the top so that you're going to attend to your health. Not that you're giving up on your patients, but just the same in battlefield medicine. If a doc's dead, he can't take care of anybody. If you guys are ineffective because of burnout or stress or other things, you're not going to be able to care for your patients. So I told you my 21-year-old daughter, this is her about 5. She's always been on a card. I put her on a plane yesterday to go to L.A. She calls me last night. She goes, Dad, you won't believe it. Caitlin Jenner's in the booth right next to me. You know, exciting for a 21-year-old. I go, great. But, you know, she was here goofing around when she's 5 or 6. But she says, you know, I blame my dad for my sweet tooth. His motto was, life is short, eat dessert first. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.